On the night of December 31st, 1997, the airport was already overwhelmed long before midnight arrived. It was just after 6 at night, but the terminal felt as if the year were already ending. Crowds filled every corridor. Suitcases rolled endlessly across the polished floor. Loudspeaker announcements overlapped one another, blending into a constant mechanical echo that never fully faded. Outside the glass walls, winter pressed in hard. The cold air of the northeastern United States cut through coats and scarves, and the sky hung low and grey, heavy with clouds that threatened snow. Inside the terminal, people loosened their jackets and breathed easier, relieved to escape the wind. New Year's Eve carried a particular tension in American airports. This was not the warmth of family reunions or holiday dinners. It was a night of escape, of unfinished years, of people hoping that crossing state lines or even oceans might allow them to leave something behind. Among the hundreds of travelers moving toward their gates, Laura Mitchell stood momentarily still. She was 32 years old, though fatigue softened the sharpness of her features and added weight to her posture. Her dark winter coat hung slightly loose on her shoulders, and her hair was pulled back hastily, strands slipping free near her temples. In one hand, she held a worn leather purse. In the other, she gripped the small, gloved hand of her son. Ethan Mitchell was 7 years old. He stayed close to her side, his backpack slung over one shoulder, the zipper broken and carefully tied with a knot. His sneakers were scuffed from years of running across sidewalks and school playgrounds. His eyes darted from place to place, absorbing the lights, the crowds, the constant movement of people who seemed to know exactly where they were going. They had arrived at the airport shortly before 6 at night. Earlier that afternoon, Laura had checked their single suitcase at a quiet counter near the entrance. She chose speed over conversation, answered questions briefly, and avoided eye contact whenever possible. To anyone watching, she looked like countless other parents traveling with a child on a holiday night. Nothing about her suggested urgency, nothing suggested fear. Yet beneath her calm exterior, her thoughts moved rapidly, circling the same unspoken concerns. This trip had not been planned months in advance. There were no excited conversations, no countdowns marked on a calendar. The decision had been made quietly, late at night, only days earlier, when the apartment they lived in had finally stopped feeling like a refuge. The apartment was small, tucked into a residential neighborhood less than 40 minutes from the airport. Laura had moved there after her divorce 3 years earlier. At first, it had felt temporary, a pause, a place to recover. But temporary had slowly turned into something heavier. Unpaid bills gathered on the kitchen counter. Court letters arrived more often. Phone calls from unknown numbers went unanswered. Every conversation about the future ended the same way, with silence. Where would they be next year? How long could she keep Ethan's life from unraveling? How much longer could she pretend stability was still within reach? The flight she booked was scheduled to depart shortly after 8 at night. A late-night flight chosen intentionally. Fewer people paying attention, fewer questions, less scrutiny. Laura checked the departure board again, even though she already knew the information by heart. The status beside their flight number remained unchanged. On time. She exhaled slowly. Ethan tugged gently at her sleeve. "Mom," he said, raising his voice just enough to be heard over the noise. "Are we going to see fireworks?" Laura crouched down in front of him, bringing herself to his level. She adjusted his scarf, making sure it covered his neck completely. "Maybe," she said softly. "Not tonight, but soon." Ethan nodded. He had learned even at his young age when questions would not bring clearer answers. They approached the security checkpoint a little after 6:30 at night. The line stretched far back between metal barriers, but it moved steadily. Laura held their documents close, her movements deliberate and controlled. Her hands did not shake, her breathing remained steady. This was not panic, this was preparation. At the security gate, the officer barely looked at them. A mother and child traveling on New Year's Eve did not stand out. Ethan followed instructions carefully, removing his jacket and placing it in the plastic bin. Laura stepped through the scanner, gathered their belongings, and guided him forward without hesitation. By 7 at night, they were inside the secured terminal. Beyond the checkpoint, the atmosphere shifted. Bars were crowded with early celebrations. Televisions above seating areas displayed countdowns for other cities, already approaching midnight. Laughter echoed from groups clinking glasses and taking photos. Laura avoided the noise and chose a quieter gate near the end of the concourse. They sat together, Ethan leaning against her side while she watched passengers board other flights. She checked her watch repeatedly, though time seemed to behave strangely, stretching when she wanted it to pass quickly, slowing when she wished it would stop. At approximately 7:35 at night, the boarding announcement echoed through the gate area. Passengers lined up in loose rows, tickets and identification ready. Laura joined the line toward the back, positioning herself behind a group of young adults, laughing loudly about their plans once they landed. Ethan looked up at her again. "Where are we going, Mom?" he asked. Laura smiled briefly. "Somewhere new," she replied. That was the last time her voice was ever recorded in a public place. Security cameras captured them walking down the jet bridge just before 8 at night. The footage showed nothing unusual. Laura holding Ethan's hand, Ethan turning his head for a moment, glancing back toward the bright terminal lights, then disappearing from view as they entered the aircraft. The plane pushed back from the gate on schedule. It taxied. It took off. And according to every official record that existed at the time, Laura Mitchell and her son Ethan vanished from the world shortly after that moment. No emergency signal was triggered, no distress call was placed, no confirmed destination was ever recorded beyond the flight manifest. When the new year arrived hours later, marked by fireworks, cheers, and celebrations across the country, no one noticed their absence. Not yet. The first hours after the flight departed passed quietly. At 12 at night, the new year arrived across the eastern United States in a cascade of fireworks, cheers, and televised countdowns. Cities glowed with celebration, streets filled with noise. For most people, the moment marked an ending and a beginning. For Laura Mitchell and her son Ethan, it passed unnoticed. The aircraft completed its journey without incident, according to official records. There were no reports of turbulence severe enough to cause concern, no emergency announcements, no delays upon landing. Passengers disembarked as usual, collecting carry-on bags and greeting loved ones waiting beyond the terminal doors. But somewhere between the moment the plane touched the ground and the early hours of the morning, Laura and Ethan vanished. At 7:40 in the morning on January 1st, 1998, the first indication that something was wrong appeared. Not at an airport, but in a quiet apartment miles away. Laura's mother, Margaret Collins, woke up early, as she always did. At 61 years old, sleep rarely lasted past sunrise. She prepared coffee in her small kitchen and turned on the television, letting the morning news play softly in the background. She expected a call. Laura had promised to check in once she landed. Not a long conversation, just enough to confirm they had arrived safely. It was a habit they had developed after the divorce, a way for Margaret to reassure herself that, no matter how strained things became, her daughter was still reachable. By 8:30 in the morning, no call had come. Margaret tried not to panic. New Year's Eve disrupted schedules. Flights were delayed. People slept late. She told herself all the reasonable explanations. At 9:15 in the morning, she called Laura's phone. It rang until voicemail picked up. Margaret left a brief message, her voice calm but tight. "Call me when you get this. Just let me know you're okay." She hung up and stared at the phone for several seconds longer than necessary. By 10:45 in the morning, concern began to outweigh logic. Margaret called again. The result was the same. Voicemail. No return call. She tried the airline next, navigating automated menus until a tired-sounding representative finally answered. Margaret explained that her daughter and grandson had been on a flight the night before and had not made contact. The representative checked the manifest. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "They were listed as having boarded. The flight arrived on time." That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. Margaret asked if anyone had missed the flight, if there were reports of passengers left behind or detained. "No, ma'am. Everything appears normal." By 12:30 in the afternoon, Margaret contacted local police. The officer who answered listened politely, but his tone remained measured. "Adults are allowed to travel without notifying family," he said. "There's no indication of a crime." "But there's a child," Margaret insisted. The officer paused. "Give it some time," he said. "If you don't hear back by tomorrow, call us again." The hours dragged on. By 6 at night, January 1st had begun to feel longer than the year that came before it. Margaret sat by the phone, television muted, watching daylight fade through the window. When the phone finally rang just after 7 at night, her heart jumped. It wasn't Laura. It was the airline, returning her earlier call. They confirmed again that Laura and Ethan had boarded. Their tickets had been scanned. Their seats were occupied during departure. But when Margaret asked where they had gone after landing, where they had collected their bags, which exit they had used, there were no answers. That information, she was told, wasn't tracked. By 10 at night, Margaret made a second call to the police. This time, a report was taken. On January 2nd, 1998, just after 9:00 in the morning, a detective from the local police department visited Margaret Collins' apartment to collect initial information. His notebook filled quickly with dates, names, and phone numbers. He asked about Laura's habits, her emotional state, her financial situation, and whether she had ever spoken about leaving without notice. Margaret answered everything honestly. Laura had been tired, worried, overwhelmed, but she had never spoken about disappearing. Never talked about starting over without telling anyone, and she would never have vanished without ensuring her son's safety. The detective nodded, writing carefully, but his expression revealed caution rather than urgency. In the weeks that followed, the case moved slowly. Airline records were reviewed again, passenger lists were checked, airport security footage was examined frame by frame. Laura and Ethan were clearly visible boarding the plane. They were seen walking down the jet bridge. After that, nothing. No footage confirmed them leaving the aircraft. No camera showed them entering the terminal. No witness came forward saying they remembered a mother and a young boy matching their description. By February of 1998, the official tone surrounding the case had shifted. Investigators began to describe the disappearance as voluntary. Laura was an adult. There was no evidence of violence, no signs of forced removal, no abandoned belongings discovered in public places. The presence of a child complicated things, but not enough, it seemed, to keep the case active. By June of 1998, resources were redirected elsewhere. The file grew thicker but colder. Margaret refused to accept that explanation. Every morning she woke up at 6:30 in the morning, prepared coffee, and called Laura's phone. Every night, just after 9 at night, she checked her voicemail before going to bed. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. By 2001, Laura had been gone for more than 3 years. Ethan would have been 10 years old. Margaret imagined him growing taller, losing baby teeth, learning to write in cursive. She imagined Laura struggling, surviving, protecting him somewhere unfamiliar. The alternative, that something irreversible had happened, was a thought she refused to allow. The apartment Margaret lived in began to change. Photos were moved, papers were reorganized. A suitcase remained untouched in the corner of a closet filled with clothes Laura had left behind. Margaret could not bring herself to donate them. Each item felt like proof that her daughter still existed somewhere. In 2006, nearly 9 years after the disappearance, the case was officially labeled inactive. Margaret was informed by mail. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, just after 2 in the afternoon. It was brief, formal, and devastating. No new leads, no evidence of criminal activity, no further action planned. Margaret read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer. She never stopped looking. She contacted advocacy groups. She submitted Laura's information to missing persons databases. She spoke to journalists who occasionally called when anniversaries approached. But the world moved on. Airports were renovated, security systems were upgraded, records were digitized. What little evidence existed was scanned, archived, and rarely revisited. By 2015, nearly 18 years had passed. Most people who had worked the original case had retired. Laura's name was now just one among thousands. But silence, as it turned out, does not erase truth. It only delays it. On March 18, 2025, at approximately 10:20 in the morning, a group of construction workers arrived at an old administrative building connected to the airport. The structure sat on the edge of the property, partially hidden from the main terminals, overlooked for years as newer facilities expanded around it. The building had once housed storage rooms, offices, and restricted access corridors used during the late 1990s. Over time, its purpose faded. Departments moved. Records were relocated. What remained was a shell, locked, dusty, and rarely entered. That morning, the workers were tasked with preparing the building for demolition. They began on the second floor, removing drywall and exposed piping. The work was routine, loud, and physical. By 11:45 in the morning, sweat soaked through their shirts, despite the cool weather outside. It was shortly after 12:10 in the afternoon when one of the workers noticed something unusual. The wall separating two narrow rooms sounded different when struck. Hollow, but not in the way drywall usually is. They stopped. Tools were set aside. Another strike confirmed it. The wall was thicker than expected, built unevenly, as if something had been sealed behind it intentionally. At 12:30 in the afternoon, a supervisor was called. By 1:15 in the afternoon, airport authorities were notified. Work stopped. A small section of the wall was carefully removed. Behind it was a hidden space, no more than 6 feet wide, stretching several yards long, sealed off from both rooms on either side. Inside, the air was stale. The smell was unmistakable. What they found forced everyone in the room to step back. Personal belongings, a child's backpack, a worn leather purse, and beneath layers of dust and debris, human remains. Authorities arrived by 2:40 in the afternoon. The building was sealed immediately. Investigators documented everything carefully, photographing each item before anything was touched. The backpack contained notebooks, pencils, and a small toy car. The purse held identification. The name on the document stopped the investigation from being just another discovery: Laura Mitchell. By 5 at night, the airport renovation project was suspended indefinitely. By 8 at night, law enforcement contacted Margaret Collins. She was 88 years old by then. The call came just after 8:15 at night. At first, Margaret did not understand what the officer was saying. The words felt distant, unreal, as if they belonged to someone else's life. Then she heard her daughter's name. She sat down slowly. After 27 years, the silence had broken. It emerged slowly through reports, interviews, and fragments of evidence that had waited nearly 3 decades to be understood. On March 20th, 2025, just after 9 in the morning, investigators held their first internal briefing after the discovery. Forensic teams confirmed what had already become clear: the remains belonged to an adult woman and a child. Time and conditions had erased many details, but personal items and identification left little doubt. Laura Mitchell and her son Ethan had never left the airport. Further examination of the building revealed something even more unsettling. The hidden space behind the wall had once been part of an unused service corridor. Blueprints from the late 1990s showed that the area had been modified during a period of rushed renovations, when oversight was minimal and documentation incomplete. Someone had taken advantage of that chaos. Investigators reconstructed the likely sequence of events. On the night of December 31st, 1997, after the plane landed, Laura and Ethan never exited with the other passengers. At some point, whether due to confusion, misdirection, or deliberate interference, they were led away from the main terminal and into restricted areas rarely monitored at the time. There was no evidence of prolonged struggle. The conclusion was devastating in its simplicity. They had been trapped. Whether a door was locked, a passage sealed, or access unintentionally cut off, Laura and Ethan were left in a space no one checked, in a building no one regularly entered. Their disappearance had not been an escape. It had been an oversight, a fatal one. By April 5, 2025, the findings were shared with Margaret Collins. She listened quietly as investigators explained everything in careful, measured language. There were apologies. There were acknowledgements of failure. There were promises that procedures had changed. Margaret did not interrupt. When they finished, she asked only one question. Did they wait long? The room fell silent. No one could answer with certainty. Laura had been 32 years old. Ethan had been 7. For 27 years, Margaret had imagined countless possibilities, some hopeful, others unbearable. The truth was neither dramatic nor mysterious. It was human, and it was permanent. The case was officially closed on May 12, 2025. A plaque was installed near the old building, simple and unassuming. It bore 2 names and 1 sentence acknowledging what had been lost and overlooked. The airport continued operating. Flights departed. New Year's Eve arrived again, as it always did. Most passengers never noticed the plaque, but some paused, some read, and some understood that not all disappearances are caused by malice or intent. Some are caused by silence, by systems that fail quietly, by moments when no one is looking. Laura and Ethan Mitchell did not vanish without reason. They vanished because they were forgotten.